Well, welcome back to the fourth of the and final lecture on world religions and an introduction to those. Last time we left off studying the evolutionary theory of religion, and now we're moving on to the monotheistic approach to religion. And so let me share the screen and we'll get started on that. All right, well, last time we took a look at these two pictures. We said that there was this subjective approach where God's created from your mind in various ways. And then we moved on to the evolutionary approach from animism, polytheism, henotheism, and then monotheism, and then whatever's next. And noted that this whole system, as it's developed, really hasn't been seen to really progress that way. And you have people that are monotheistic that have animistic aspects, and some that are monotheistic that don't have some of these, or all of them. And so this brings us over to the next approach, the monotheistic approach, in this approach, God exists in and of himself, doesn't come from our minds. You know, humans may evolve in their cultures as far as, from, having what we would say, small structures to bigger structures, expanded in their knowledge and so forth. But the truth of the matter is, God is existing under all those circumstances as the one God. He's communicated humanity. He's provided revelation to them through prophets, and ultimately through Christ for Christians, and through nature. Nature itself teaches that there would be a God. And so, and it points out for Christian theology that we're created in the image of God. And so God is the source of religion, not humanity being the source of religion, as in the other two theories. So we're going to move on into the monotheistic approach and see how that very much agrees with what we've seen going on in the world, and of course agrees with what God has revealed in the Bible. So for those of us who do follow the Bible, it is very much a part of what the Bible teaches as well. So in the monotheistic approach, it begins with a God who reveals himself in history, and humanity responds to his self-disclosure, and through that produce religion according to his criteria. And so we have to realize that God doesn't leave it up to just our subjective selves. And so this relationship between humanity and God in the Bible is depicted as having always occurred from the very beginning of humanity, no matter if they lived in mud huts or in big societies. That we can go back and find ancient societies that have huge buildings and things thousands of years before Christ. But God is always there. So in talking about monotheism, we talk about 9-point basic beliefs of monotheism. And so these help us to look at monotheism as it's depicted in the Bible. And now, not always do people agree on exactly these 9 points, but there is the idea of there's one God. Now, how people understand that one God when they read the Bible or don't read the Bible, as the case may be, they may see God in various levels of relationship. You have most of the founding fathers of the U.S., for example, were traditional believers in God and believe he's all powerful and was a relational God. But you had a few that were deistic in their view. In other words, they did believe God created everything and made everything run by natural law, and that he is instruction on morals and so forth were necessary so that this new experiment of the new society being founded in the United States, the American institution of government, needed those moral instructions. But they didn't believe God was a personal God. They just believed he put everything into motion, deistic view. And and there were no such things as miracles and so forth. So there are various levels of relationship with God. God is described with masculine qualities in grammar. However, there are languages that don't have masculine and feminine, like the Meru people didn't. So when you translate God, it's just God. And but generally that's the case. God lives beyond the created world. In other words, he is not a part of this world. He's not physical. He is transcendent, as we talked about in definition of our definition of religion. God is extremely powerful and knowledgeable. Now, notice extremely powerful and knowledgeable, not all powerful, not all knowledgeable. That's because there are various views in certain monotheistic beliefs that God either limits himself or they view him as limited in various ways or offset by evil power in some way. But so you have various levels of that as well. But generally, it's God created the world. He set the standards for good and evil by which people should go by. Humans are seen as God's creation and subject to his standards. And then seventh point was eighth point actually. Humans are alienated from God by disobeying his standards. And then the last one, God provides a way for humanity to be reconciled. And we can see this throughout, for example, in Christianity, this is very much a part of it. And so that is your 9 points, basic beliefs of monotheism. And you'll probably be asked about those on exams and so forth. This brings us to a fellow by the name of Wilhelm Schmidt, a theologian back in the 19th century and on in the 20th. He was a professor of linguistics. He wrote a 12-volume set of books entitled The Origins Idea of God in German. And I think recently it's being translated. It hadn't been translated up to this point fully, but I heard recently that there's a translation in the works. But he went to a lot of cultures and studied various cultures, their language and so forth, because he was a linguist. And he documented reports of traditional religions and cultures that referred to monotheism. So he basically saw that a lot of traditional cultures had the basic idea and the basic monotheistic beliefs like the 9 points we were looking at. And so a number of traditional cultures practiced little or no magic, but believed in like one creator God. And so in his 12-volume works, he documents a lot of this information and comes to the conclusion that most traditional cultures had a monotheistic belief to begin with. So basically, he said, as Cordovan kind of summarizes it in your textbook, virtually every religion carries a vestige of monotheism that can be identified as a variation of the 9-point description of monotheism. So, so we have to realize that there is a case to be made that cultures began with monotheism and that God working in those cultures from the very beginning. And we see this in the Old Testament before the time of Judaism, that God's working with individuals there. You see Melchizedek, a priest to the Most High God. Well, where did he come from? He was there. And you had people worshiping the one God and God working to bring people to understand who the one God is. So if there is one clear change, it's what we see moving away from monotheism, particularly today. We see it in wealthier cultures where, there's a lot more secularists or humanists human secularism and so forth. But even in the Bible, you see a movement, oftentimes a way to worshiping one God, multiple gods. I mean, and people involved in witchcraft and so forth. You have ritual magic becoming prevalent, moving people away from monotheism. We often think of the uh, first century with Christianity that it was mainly people believing in multiple gods, and there was plenty of that around. But we need to realize too that there was a real push to in the area of the occult, so spirits and evil spirits and things like that, and magic and so forth was very popular. And you can see this when you look at some of the things in Ephesus and other places. So again, there's all that going on. You also see a call to reform, to go back to the original monotheism. See this with the Old Testament prophets. The Israelites would go off and start worshiping gods and goddesses like their neighbors and so forth. The prophets would come out and say, "No, you need to come back, worship the one God," and so forth. And so that's part of what we see going on. So the move generally is away from the idea of one God, and it's not evolutions, it's de-evolution from the concept of monotheism down to various other beliefs. Well, Cordovan gives this kind of diagram. I think it's in his first edition. That you have your original monotheism that's put forward in the Bible, but you get various monotheistic traditions, and we'll be talking about some of those traditions, like Islam, Zoroastrianism, Baha'i. But beyond that, it decays into magic and rituals, spiritual rituals and stuff, and not associated with God. And then you get various forms of religious change, just things like mana, animism, polytheism, henotheism. All of these are aspects, and these can take precedence over the one God, and people emphasize these over that concept of God. Well, that's the concept of monotheism. Now, I want to go over a little bit about, as we go further into these studies and start looking at particular specific religions, I want to talk about a little bit about some of the things we'll be covering. Right after this, we're going to talk about the status of religion in the world, and then talk a little bit about worldview. Then we'll get into the specific religions. Traditional religions, we can break up religions into categories. One of the first categories is traditional religions. This is like Native American, African religions, Chinese popular religions. And we're only going to be take a brief look at Native American and African religions. They all have similar concepts involved with them, but they do have some variations. These are mainly religions that are not preserved in written form, so you don't have a spelled out theology in written form for them. They developed over time and passed down from generation to generation. A lot of belief and animism involved with them. There's also something called totemism that we'll talk about again over in Native American religions, but this is a belief in the kinship of a group of people with a common totem. And a totem is an animal or plant which serves as a symbol representing that family or clan. For example, among Native Americans, you might say, my totem is the wolf. And so you have this totem pole, which has pictures of the wolf animal. Early Christians sometimes made the mistake of thinking that the Native Americans worshipped. These were idols they worshipped, and that was not the case. But that's the problem when we don't know a lot about religions. So that's why we study religions today, is to not make that mistake when we go to a culture. You'll run into ancestor worship in these traditional religions and even polytheism. But remember, a good number of these religions also had the idea of one God, like the Meru people. They just believed in the one God. And so we need to keep that in mind as well. Religions originating in India, we'll be talking about Hinduism with many gods. You have Jainism, which we will not cover in this class, but many gods with a supreme god. And then Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, there's no god, but you got Mahayana Buddhism, which has elevated Buddha to God, basically. And then you got Sikhism, one god because of the influence of Islam, but you also have the concept that comes from Hinduism of reincarnation. And again, the idea of being released from this cycle of birth, death, rebirth, what we call reincarnation, they call it samsara, which the circular view of time, which is quite different from the Christian view of linear time. There's a creation, a beginning, and there will be an end. Released by the aid of God or gods, but often by the good actions or lack of bad actions. In other words, this idea of reincarnation occurs in Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism. It is the only way to get released from this cycle, which that cycle is considered to be bad. In some views in the American use of reincarnation, like in New Age and so forth, it's thought to be a positive thing, but in these religions, it's something you want to get a release from, but you can only do it based on your own good works, and it's almost impossible to get released. Only very few ever manage to accomplish it. We'll talk about that as we get into it further. Religions originating in China and Japan, Taoism. Notice the T is pronounced with a D. That's because of the translating of Chinese script. The older version uses T's when it has a D sound for some reason, but they believe creative force in all things, numerous gods that express what's called the Tao. Shintoism, the kami are gods or spirits of ancestors, nature. Confucianism, the ten, the heaven. Personal deity, more of a concept or philosophical principle and belief in spirits to some degree. But we will actually not be covering any of those. There's too many things to cover as it is. But in the graduate courses on religion, we cover those more fully. Excuse me. All right. Well, religions originating in the Middle East, where we'll be spending a lot of our time. Judaism, Zoroastrianism, Christianity, Islam, Baha'i. They share a belief in one supreme creator God. The power of that God may vary to some degree, like in Zoroastrianism. Uh, Only one earthly life, so there's not this circular cycle of birth, death, rebirth. It's linear, beginning and end. There's one earthly life. They see the material world as positive instead of negatively, as in the case of the religions like Hinduism, Buddhism, and so forth. So those are some distinctions for religions originating in the Middle East. Here is a world religious timeline that I have. It's also in the handouts, and you'll see them on Canvas there, noted where you can download the individual handout, but it just gives you an idea of when religions began, basically, and so that you can have an overall view of these religions and when they came into being, at least as best we can do it from the information we have. Let's talk a little bit about ritual, folk religion, the rites of passage, that kind of thing. These are just some terminology that we will have opportunities to talk about at different times. So I'm just going to cover this type of thing to so that you'll be aware of that terminology. Magic ritual is repetitive actions performed in order to bring about a specific result, like we talked about under the thing magic there in the evolutionary approach. But at the same time, you can have priesthoods, group of leaders who perform rituals on behalf of people. Now, this could be in a magic sense for some religions, but like in Judaism, the priesthood, they were just set aside to represent the people before God, not necessarily use some magic, although they may have devolved into that at times and even worshiped other gods at times. This The idea of taboo comes in. For example, the priesthood for Judaism, only those of a particular tribe, Levites, could be priests, and it was taboo or not permitted for others to do that. Even there were areas that were taboo for people to enter. The Holy of Holies, for example, was off limits except for once a year by the chosen priest. So you have all these type of things that come into play in religion. Some religions have taboo in the sense, the certain types of power and utilize certain type of power taboo. But there is proper ritual, which is defined as the focus must be on God's intention to impact human affairs rather than on the power of the ritual to attract God's attention. Like magical ritual is more of getting God's attention or some form of manipulation of spiritual powers. Proper ritual just means that God's impacted us. And so to recognize that impact, we have rituals. For example, taking the Lord's Supper for Christians in the Christian church represents what God has done for us through Christ's death on the cross. So we commemorate that as Christ said to, and that's a type of proper ritual. And you have other rituals as well. Folk religion, you'll hear me talk about folk religion at different times. This is the everyday religious practice of the common people with little influence from intensive training in practice and sacred writings. That's a mouthful, but it basically just means that there are things that are said to be this is part of being the essence of a religion and their practice and their theology of that they believe in. But in daily practice, people tend to not necessarily follow the actual theology in their daily lives. You have this theoretical understanding that the scholars may have of their religion. That's like in Christianity or in Islam, you can see this, but that the people themselves may not follow that. So they're actually, for example, my son worked among Muslim people in Tanzania, but they were folk Islam. They were a mixture of Islamic thinking that there's one God, but they had a lot of traditional religion and ancestors and evil spirits type of things all mixed in with it in their daily practice. And the same thing can happen with Christianity too, that you got people that practice as Christians, but sometimes they mix in things from New Age or things like that. And it's a mix, and you get people that mix Christian with Eastern religions, thought, reincarnation, or mana, so forth. That can always happen. And so I was just realized folk religion is oftentimes a mix of one religion with other things of the culture. Rite of passage is something that's common in all cultures and is impacted by religion as well. A ceremony indicating a transition from one stage of life to another. It's a type of ritual, and it's celebrated more in some cultures than other cultures. And And so a rite of passage may be more than optional, may be required, or the person cannot move on to the next stage. For example, it's the there's a lot of things that go around for a transition among the Meru people, that you move from childhood to adulthood. And part of that ritual is circumcision for both male and females, which is not something that we see like in our culture in the United States. We don't really have any kind of ceremony that says this person moved from being a child to an adult. We flounder around saying, well, when is a child an adult? Is it 18? When you get a driver's license, or some states 16, or 21 when they can drink, or whatever it may be. We just don't have that, and we don't really celebrate that. But some cultures do, some religions do, like Judaism and so forth. So we just have to realize that. But we do tend to celebrate births and deaths and marriages and so forth. So your four main types of rites of passage in pretty much any culture, and often show up in religious ceremonies, is your birth, puberty, marriage, and death. And so we just need to keep those things in mind as we study religions and cultures and worldviews and so forth. Um, Paul, one of the things we need to talk about is a Christian's approach to other religions. And Paul's a good example of this, because he was doing mission work in the first century among multiple cultures. And he himself was a multicultural person, being a Pharisee Jew, but he grew up in Tarsus, which was a multicultural city, even above Athens at that time. It had more of the philosophical schools, things like that. So he was very versed in the various cultures of the time. And so when he went out to share the gospel message, he did it with knowledge of the various cultures. You can see this in Acts 17, where he's on Mars Hill in Athens, and he starts talking to people there, but he gives credit to the fact that they are religious. He says, I perceive that you are religious. There's that term religion there. Now, so there's a few translations I think translate it superstitious, but he's recognizing a phenomenon that they are worshiping gods and goddesses, because he says, I see all these gods and goddesses along the road, and I saw that there was a statue to the unknown God. And he says, I want to tell you about that unknown God. And he says, that's the one God. And he moves from that one God idea down to talking about Christ. So he starts where the people are. And that's how we should approach the study of world religions, that we need to start where the people are that we're engaged with, if they are people of another religion, another culture, another country, and always approach their beliefs with respect. And so that becomes very important. So we'll talk about here some criteria for studying, working with people of other cultures. And this is where we'll end our session for this final session of this series. But as we move into to the various religions that we'll study, we just need to remember that when we're with people, we can talk about it theoretically, but when we're with people, we're talking about things that are involved in their daily lives and are important to them, and we should treat them respectfully. So, criteria for sharing the gospel is to treat every person and their religion with respect. And we can do that with anyone, even when we may not agree with them, just like lifestyles. People have different lifestyles, but that doesn't mean we disrespect them as human beings, because they are also created in the image of God. So, as Paul says, live in peace with all people so long as it depends on you. And I think that's good. He's a guy that had to practice that a lot, I'm sure, in his life. We need to learn from them their understanding of their religion. Now, remember that we can study it, but that's at a theoretical level. And this is, if their scholars got together. They said, this is what our religion is all about. But you get down to the daily lives of people and their folk religious beliefs, it may not look a lot like that to some degree. And we just have to sit with them and learn what they believe about their own religion. So the theoretical understanding of religion often does not agree with the daily practice and beliefs of its followers. Look for points of contact between Christianity and the religion, like I was talking about with Paul there, talking about the unknown God. So that was a contact point to talk about the one true God. Note obstacles in their beliefs for further exploration. Sometimes there are beliefs in particular religions that are so contrary to, for example, those of us as Christians, that goes so against our belief system. And oftentimes it's hard for people to reject those and accept Christian beliefs. And we have to realize those are difficult things, like the concept of the Trinity for Muslims is very difficult and hard for them to get past. And those are obstacles, and those are not things you want to start with when you're first talking to them. Those are the type of things you have to build up to and learn more about the person themselves and their beliefs before you start tackling some of the bigger issues. Do not let your own cultural bias obscure or supplant the gospel message. This is often a problem because when you talk to people of other religions, oftentimes they are in different cultures. Even though now you have a lot of religions here in the U.S., different from Christianity, but they're living in an American culture, they still have a lot of their cultural stuff from where they came from. But others are, just part of the American culture now. So you have to take that into consideration, but don't let your own cultural bias. This happens in Acts 15, where the Jewish Christian says, before you can become a Christian, you have to become a Jew. You have to be circumcised, keep the law, and so forth. And Paul goes, oh, no, 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 that's not what Jesus said. And so you have this council to try to resolve this issue. We can do that sometimes. We let our own cultural bias that to be, a Christian, you have to buy into our culture. That's not the case. Christ's salvation is available to people no matter what their culture. And so we need to keep that in mind. And then lastly, make the gospel intelligible to the host people. As Paul put it, I became all things to all people that I may save many. And so that tells us we have to be sensitive to people from different cultures, different belief systems, and find ways to make the gospel understandable to them given their cultural understanding, their particular religious understanding of things. And that's not always easy. It certainly it can be very challenging, but that means you have to be open to listening a lot to them. So despite the fact that we will study world religions here, if I could give you one big piece of advice is always listen to the people from those religions to see what they're thinking. Don't just assume that because you've studied a particular religion that represents them, because there are many sects within every religion, and they can be very complex, and you'll be forever sorting them out. Even people who grow up in a particular religion don't understand all the variations that may have occurred in the religion. So just a word of advice there as we conclude this series of lectures on world religion and introducing the concept of world religions and just religion itself. So I will cut it off there and tell you goodbye, and that gets us through our this series, and we will start a new series coming up next. But meantime, study well, and see you later.